The Torah that reading this week is Parshat Behar, and which we're finishing off the third book of the Torah, the book of Vayikra, the book of about the priestly issues and matters in terms of offerings and the Mishkan. And we're also in the midst of counting up towards Shavuot, from Pesach to Shavuot. And Behar always falls in that realm. So what I want to look at tonight, the title of this class is, and I've been criticized for not saying the title clearly enough, it's really Meet Your Better Self, or looking at Shmittah, the sabbatical year, Yovel, the 50th Jubilee year, and Shavuot as a means of getting to know ourselves better and to meet our own better selves. That's the topic we're going to look at. And counting is a big deal. I mean, every seventh year is a Shmittah year, and that's like Shabbos. It comes every 7 years, counting or not, Jewish people in the land of Israel or not. We all know when a Shmittah year comes, we simply can calculate it out. The Yovel year, the 50th Jubilee year, however, requires that the Sanhedrin count 7 Shmittah years. And then at the end of the 7th Shmittah year, they proclaim the 50th year as the Jubilee year. And that is exactly in sync with what we're counting. I mean, we're at the end of Tuesday in the Jewish calendar. And today has been the 31st day of the Omer, which is 4 weeks and 3 days in the Omer. And just a few minutes from now, we'll be able to count the next night of the Omer. And we're counting from day 1, right after the first day of Pesach, through 49 days, 7 full weeks. And then the 50th day is going to be Shavuot. So they see an exact parallel between the two. So I want to first comment that counting itself, especially counting time, right away evokes the notion of an orderly process and a way of achieving something. Now it's day 1, day 2. It's like if someone's anticipating or preparing for something. So a person looks at the calendar, or imagine you want to build a building and you say, I want to move into my house 50 days from now. Okay, so you hire a manager who plots everything out in a time system. And on the first day, you have to accomplish this milestone of work. And the next day, you accomplish the next milestone of work. And in an orderly way, day by day, you build a foundation and you build the walls and you build a home. And on the 50th day, you're able to move into it. That's the notion of counting that we're talking about here. And there's a parallel. The Sanhedrin counts 7 Shemitahs, cycles of 7 years each. And at the conclusion of the 7th one, they proclaim Yovel, the Jubilee year, with all of the laws that apply to that, which include freeing the slaves, everyone returning back to their land of heritage and inheritance in the land of Israel. And indeed, we know that Liberty Bell is inscribed with a sentence from this week's Torah reading, and you shall proclaim liberty throughout the land. Ukrotem dror b'chol haaretz. Word dror is an unusual word in Hebrew, but it means, in a sense, to be free, to be unencumbered. And we see how that works by again reclaiming your original lands. And we also see how it works in terms of those who are enslaved, those Jewish people who have been enslaved going free. And you should know it's a pretty unbelievable thing to think about a society that every 7 years commerce stops. Because after all, the main venture of ancient lands was to produce food. And even in the United States, I read historically that the largest change in society from 1900 until today is that I think in 1900, and I don't have the numbers in front of me, but something like over 70%, and it really was significantly over 70% of the United States population was producing the food so that people could eat. And today it's something like 3 or 4% of the population producing the food here domestically in any event, at least agriculturally growing it. A lot of people were involved in restaurants and food processing and things like that. but in terms of growing that which we eat agriculturally, it's a tiny percentage of our population. And that's a complete flip from what always was in the world. So when the Torah says every 7 years you can't touch the land, it's saying something really wow, saying something really amazing. Just as we all know that when the Torah says every 7th day of the week, a person should not work and should rather adopt a different mode of behavior, that's a big challenge for people, especially today, and especially at a time when we have this view of ourselves as individuals being producers, almost like being machines that can produce X amount of revenue or X amount of sales or whatever it is that we think we produce in the course of a week. So we're sort of tied down to this idea that how could a person simply unplug for 1 day a week? How could a society unplug for 1 year every 7? And then when it comes to the 49th year, stay unplugged for the 50th year, so that 2 years in a row, normal productive activity ceases, which was agriculture, and people were free, and therefore looking to pursue something else. And that's where the title of this class comes from, getting to know our better selves, because built into this Torah system of time, it impresses upon us the notion that of who we really are. We must be something more or other than what we produce. So that's the topic of this class. Now, so what are the parallels? We talked about the counting. Another parallel. The mitzvah to blow shofar appears twice in the Torah. Once it appears associated with Rosh Hashanah, and once it appears associated with proclaiming Yovel, that on the evening at the end of Yom Kippur, on the beginning of the 50th year, just in the beginning of this Jubilee year, we have a mitzvah for the Sanhedrin to blow the shofar, and that's the idea of proclaiming freedom throughout the land. So I want to stop for a moment and look at a contrast. And being a shofar blower myself, I just want to make this point very clear. When we blow shofar on Rosh Hashanah, we have this image, a metaphorical sense that the Medrash writes out for us, that the day of judgment is coming, and God Almighty sits in a chair of judgment, just like a judge convening a courtroom. And then we come and we blow the shofar, and that induces God to get up out of the seat of judgment, and instead God seats God in a chair of compassion and kindness. It evokes a sense of Abraham's readiness to offer Isaac as an offering. It evokes many other moments in Jewish history, but it's associated with the notion of inducing God to see us differently, to see us in a more kindly, forgiving way, in a more understanding way, in a more compassionate way. And we're very familiar with that. We know that there are times that there are people that can do something in front of us, and it can bother us and trouble us and anger us and make us feel as though what they're doing is terribly unjust. And there are other times where we're more easygoing about what goes on around us, and it doesn't evoke any sense of judgment or anger or harshness on our part. So we're understanding that about ourselves, that there are different glasses, so to speak, rose-colored glasses to see things through, as opposed to harsher glasses to see things through. And that's the notion of blowing the shofar in Rosh Hashanah. When we blow the shofar on Yovel, what we're doing is we're saying, wake up, be inspired, and we're going to talk about be inspired by what? And free those people around you, reset the society in a certain sense, restart everything with a clean slate. Those who have fallen into slavery, become free. Those who owe money, their debts are canceled. That happens every time Shmittah comes around. And those who have had to sell their inheritance and in a certain sense are homeless or unbound or unconnected to the land of the Jewish people, they become reconnected to themselves. So I want to explain a little bit about how this process works, because what we see in the notion of slavery particularly is that we have a system of enslavement where if a person steals and can't pay back money, they have a certain term of indentured time, and then they go free. And if they choose not to go free, we drill a hole in their ear with the notion that you stood at Mount Sinai and you heard God's proclamation that we are the nation of God, and therefore you should rightfully feel that you're a servant of God and not a servant of another human being who's a servant of God, which is a reduction in your sense of yourself and your sense of your proper place within society. So when a slave chooses to prolong his enslavement, a Jewish slave chooses to prolong his or her enslavement, what the person is saying is, I don't want to accept the freedom and the responsibility that comes with that freedom that God intends for me to have. And that's considered to be a breach of what the Torah really aspires for people to do, which is to live free, choosing lives, albeit within the confines of Hashem's Torah, and in a certain sense, not being a servant to a fellow human being, but being a servant to God. And a lot of times when you teach this idea to young people, teenagers especially, people say, well, if I'm a servant anyway, what's the difference who I'm a servant to? And it's really hinted at in the Passover Haggadah, and I think I mentioned it this year. When we start off this Seder and we say, Avodim hayinu leparo b'Mitzrayim, we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. Now, not that many of the Jews were enslaved to Pharaoh. They were enslaved to families of Egyptians. They were enslaved to national servitude, but they weren't serving Pharaoh. But what the Haggadah is meant to tell us is, well, who would you rather serve? Would you rather serve someone like Pharaoh, who's a wicked person? And even if he was a righteous Pharaoh, he's just a fellow human being like you? Or would you rather have the honor and the privilege of serving Hashem? And I would point out, to support this notion of being integral to Shmittah and Yovel, is the fact that there are 24 mitzvot in this week's Torah reading, 7 positive and 17 negative. And if you look through the listing, you will find that many of them are meant to protect the dignity of one's fellow. I could read many examples to you. One says that there should be courts of law, so when a dispute arises, people don't slug it out, but rather they have proper recourse to find justice without there being any putting down of anyone else. There's a prohibition to distress a fellow Jew verbally, to say something that would embarrass him, and we're going to discuss that a little bit more. There's a prohibition of the manner in which a slave is worked by its master, because again, it needs to protect the dignity of the person who is in the weakened position. And it's really not a parallel to say that when Jefferson wrote that you can judge the quality of a democracy by how it treats its minority, it is important to note here that you can judge the quality of a society by how people treat those people who are in fact in a subservient position to them. And the Torah over and over and over again, especially in these 24 mitzvot, many of them have to do with protecting the dignity of one's fellow man. Now, let's take a minute and talk about the counting of the Sfirat HaOmer, which is not in this week's Torah reading, but we're in the middle of it, as I mentioned. Today, on Tuesday, we counted the 31st day of the Omer, and we're counting our way from the day of the Exodus from Egypt. The next day, we begin counting 7 weeks of 7 days each, 49 days, and then the 50th day was when we stood at Mount Sinai and we received the Torah. the notion being there that there had to be a distancing in time of the Jewish people leaving Egypt and finding their balance and understanding themselves as human beings so that they could properly stand at Mount Sinai. And what did we proclaim at Mount Sinai? Naaseh v'nishma. We will fulfill the Torah and we will understand it. We'll study it so that we can benefit from its concepts and from its ideas. But first and foremost, we will fulfill it. We're like servants of God. So when God issues an edict, whatever it is, not to embarrass our fellow human being, so we have to first and foremost implement it and practice it and uphold it. And then we can learn the philosophy behind it. We can see how it can impact us further as human beings, how it could make us better, kinder, more able to fulfill the Torah without as much tension and without as much inner conflict. But that's what we're commended to do. So I want to frame the notion of Sfirat HaOmer in terms of what we're going to discuss today as giving us the opportunity to, in an orderly way, develop ourselves as people, to come in, to leave behind the negative influences of Egypt and to become more in touch with who we are as blossoming, developing Jewish people. And therefore, what do we have within ourselves that can latch on to the Torah system of living and the Torah system of thinking and be able to muster the energy to study Torah and understand it so that we can reach a point where we fulfill what the Torah has going for us. And of course, when the Jewish people stood at Mount Sinai, this is not a mitzvah, but the fact is that the shofar was blown. So again, we see this parallel of the shofar proclaiming freedom. That's the sense we have of the shofar blowing at Mount Sinai. It's not like the shofar blowing on Rosh Hashanah to induce God to be more compassionate, but rather it's like the shofar blowing at the beginning of Yovel to inspire us and to awaken us to utilize the opportunity of having the Torah or of having a year, a second year in the case of the Jubilee year, where we're not bound to our usual labor and work, so that we could focus on something else and develop ourselves better as people. And what I would say, just to tie this part of the class together, is that every Jewish person said Naaseh v'nishma, but and every Jewish person achieved a level of prophecy, of prophetically hearing the word of God directly from God at Sinai. All of us did. No matter what stature you might imagine you have, no matter what your capacity is, great or limited, no matter where you stood vis-a-vis the mountain, each person achieved that. But we know from a medrash that everybody's Naaseh v'nishma was different. And therefore, because everybody had developed to a different point from having left Egyptian society, which is antithetical to Judaism, and having gotten these 7 weeks of 7 days to transform ourselves through introspection, through growth, through preparing ourselves, through counting toward the revelation at Sinai. So that when we got there, just like in any other situation, each of us had our unique way of saying Naaseh v'nishma. We will do and we will listen. For some of us, it was complete dedication, analogous to the way Abraham conducted his life, where his heart was ne'eman, his heart was pure and devoted to God. And for others of us, it was on a weaker stature. And hence, when we were tested over the time in the wilderness, when we were tested on the journey to get to the land of Israel, when different situations arose, some of us fell off the table at that point, sinned at the golden calf, complained about the water being bitter, or all the other events that we know take place in the wilderness. Whereas others of us remained, we had a depth of commitment to Naaseh v'nishma, to being servants of God, that we were able to resiliently deal with those challenges and go on and continue. So that's the process we're looking at. So in what sense does the shofar blowing at Har Sinai, which is in a certain sense binding us to 613 commandments, how is that a sense of freedom analogous to the freedom proclaimed at Yovel? And the answer to that is that if we truly understood ourselves, when we look in the mirror, if we saw something beyond the surface of ourselves, and to the extent that we see something beyond the surface of ourselves, then we would understand that in the same way you have to stop work to come to understand yourself as something more than a producer of goods. You know, I'm a farmer. I grow 600 bushels of wheat a year. Great. That's a way of defining yourself. But we know from the rest of the Torah, you're also a being created in the image of God. So that when Shabbat comes, you say, as a godly person, I'm going to cease and desist from my role as being a producer of wheat, and I'm going to actualize and get better in touch with myself as a creation in the image of God, with an opportunity to come close to God and to live a spiritual life. So that's the parallel between the shofar that's blown at the start of Yovel and the shofar that we heard at Mount Sinai. And it's a parallel between the counting of 7 years and then 7 times 7 years and having Yovel and blowing the shofar, and the Jewish people leaving Egypt tainted by their experience in Egypt and needing to overcome its shortcomings, and counting 7 days 7 times for 7 full weeks, and then being ready to stand at Mount Sinai, being ready to receive the Torah with the sound of the shofar blowing behind us, and to various extents based on our own stage of development, to be free to be true to the spiritual nature that's within me, to the extent that I recognize that it's there. And I want to just play this out with a couple of concluding sources, and I think you'll see how this works. In Pirkei Avot, in chapter 4, the first Mishnah there, the Mishnah answers, who is honored? Ezu mechubar. Who is an honored person? And the Mishnah answers, one who honors others. Sounds like a nice idea. But then the Mishnah does something strange. It says, how do we know that it's someone who honors others who's truly honored? So it quotes a sentence from the book of Samuel 1, chapter 2, sentence 30. And it says, I, God, honor those who honor me. End of quote. So there's something confusing here. What's confusing here is, how does a Mishnah use a sentence of God speaking about the way God deals with people who show honor to God as a paradigm for us to learn how we can achieve an honorable status as a human being by showing honor to others? And the commentaries answer almost in one voice, because when you show honor to someone else, you're recognizing that person as a person created in the image of God, just like you're created in the image of God. And therefore, you're coming into touch with what the ultimate value of people is, what its source is. And then it becomes parallel to God saying, God honors those who honor God. And when I show honor to a fellow human being, I'm in fact showing honor to God. And that's going to elevate me. And therefore, I'm going to be a more honorable person. And the analogy that's given by the rabbis is that if I see a work of art that an artist created, and I praise that work of art, what am I doing? I'm truly praising the artist who created it. So as much as I say, wow, did you see that painting? Look at the colors, look at the lighting, look at the perspective, whatever aspect of that piece of art that captures my attention, and I'm just talking about that piece of art, we understand that we're ultimately talking about the artist who created it. So therefore, when I treat another human being as being honorable and deserving of honor and respect, and I speak to a person in that manner, and I take pains not to embarrass that person, I take pains to not put that person down, I take pains to have proper judicial channels for everyone to settle disputes, as is written out in this week's Torah reading, in order to avoid punching the guy in the nose or him punching me in the nose, which is dishonorable behavior. So as I do that, I'm really opening my own eyes to who I am as a being created in the image of God. And I even want to point out this mechanism just a little bit deeper. Because when we talked about love your neighbor as yourself a few weeks ago in the Parsha of Kedoshim, we mentioned the idea that ultimately it's impossible for a person to love someone else as much as he loves himself. Because it's really beyond normal human limitations. We always look at ourselves favorably. We always cut excuses for ourselves, at least to a greater extent than we do for other people. So therefore, there is a limit to the extent to which a person can truly love someone else as much as equal to the manner in which they love themselves. But if you think about it here, what's really interesting to note is this. If I honor the other person on the basis that this person also is a being created in the image of God, so as I do that, and as I reinforce the notion that we're both that way, I'm narrowing that gap of limitation, and I'm making myself more capable of approaching the true fulfillment of V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, of loving your neighbor like yourself. You hear this idea? In other words, in the end of the day, you know, when there's one ice cream cone on the table and there's two of us, not a good example, but and as a trite example, it's likely that I'm going to want to have the ice cream cone for myself, and I'll prefer that over really just taking joy in the fact that you're enjoying eating an ice cream cone. But how can I possibly grow in this area, even beyond what seems like absolute human limitations? Well, by treating you respectfully and coming more and more and more to see you as a fellow image of God, just like I am, then I begin to dig into the notion that, well, you and I share this commonality, we share this common dignity, we share this common greatness. And therefore, in treating you carefully, I'm revising the way I see myself as well. And I'm elevating beyond a selfish consideration of myself to tapping into my own dignity as a being created in the image of God. And that's why I wanted to quote a Gemara from Bava Metzia, page 58b, which is always quoted in relation to this Torah portion. And this already is in the time of the Amoraim, the time when the main Jewish community was in Babylonia, and there was just a small rabbinic community left in the land of Israel, and people would travel back and forth on occasion. So it says very clearly that Reb Dimi comes to the land of Israel, and he sees a group of rabbis, and he says, please teach me, what do you do here in the land of Israel, most especially to distinguish yourselves from we Jews who live in the diaspora? And he is told we're more careful not to cause any embarrassment one person to another. Now, all the commentaries say, well, not embarrassing another person is not a mitzvah that's dependent on the land of Israel. There's no reason in the world why people living in the land of Israel would be naturally more inclined to be more careful not to embarrass others than Jews living elsewhere in the world. Why would that be? And an answer given is the following answer. Because living in the land of Israel at the time of the destruction of the temple awakens within us the clear sense that what ultimately brought about the destruction of the temple was that famous incident of a party in Kamsa, Bar Kamsa, and he left in a huff because he was embarrassed and humiliated, and the rabbis didn't come to defend him. So the people of the land of Israel were hypersensitive to the consequences of causing embarrassment to someone else. Because if I honor you and elevate you, I'm elevating both of us. And that's what the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot chapter 4 says. By giving honor to someone else, I become more honorable myself. Certainly by embarrassing someone else and by attacking the honor of that person and by humiliating that person, I'm convincing myself that that's not something we share in common. That's not our essence. That's not who we really should be mindful of. So when I put you down, I'm putting myself down. And that's a vicious cycle, a downward spiral. And who better than the people of the land of Israel living in a ruined country, not, with Jerusalem under the boot of Rome, could better understand that we better be very, very careful never to embarrass anyone else, and rather to fulfill the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot in chapter 4, Mishnah 1, which is to go out of our way to give honor to other people, which of course leads to a spiral on the upside, where the more I treat you honorably, the more I'm reminding myself that you are a being created in the image of God, which reflects back on the way I see myself as a being created in the image of God, which enables me to truly approach the Torah's ideal of loving your neighbor as yourself. And we've discussed this in the past, but that's also the lesson of the mourning period for the students of Rebbe Akiva, which takes place at the same time. It's not biblical, it's not in the Torah. There's no mitzvot in the Torah related to the fact that we don't have weddings until after Lag BaOmer, which takes place in another couple of days, because the source of that also was that they didn't show proper respect for one another. And all this opens our eyes to this very, very, very notion that as we avoid putting anyone down, avoid causing people pain or embarrassment or shame, as we become more meticulous in that for the right reason, because I want to respect you as a fellow creature of God, which means even I may not like you particularly. I may not enjoy your company. I may not like to listen to your playlist of music, but I'm going beyond the surface to say, in your essence, you and I are both creations of God. We both have this godly image within us. So I'm going to take care to respect you. And in doing that, I'm reinforcing my own notion of myself. And that's where we approach the topic of this week's class, meeting your better self, or taking the mitzvah of the sabbatical year and the Yovel Jubilee year and Shavuot, and looking at them in combination as they fall out at the same time of the year, and we're busy counting and counting and counting, and have us understand that there's a process here where I'm not only refining my behavior toward others, I'm not only refining my actions, but I'm refining my self-image as well. And I'm really getting to understand myself and know myself as a better being, know myself as a spiritual being, know myself as a person who ultimately on Shavuot, when we celebrate Matan Torah, when we celebrate the giving of the 10 Commandments and the receiving of the luchot, of the tablets of law, and when we celebrate having accepted upon ourselves the yoke of 613 commandments, we can feel as though we're really bringing out our true inner selves, and we're really experiencing freedom. So Pesach, we started a process of Zman Cherutenu. We became free from the boot of Pharaoh, and we're working our way towards freeing ourselves from the selfish interest and the need to put other people down and the need to dominate other people and the need to feel as though, get out of my way because I want what you have. And as we diminish that and we replace that with a sense of being respectful toward others, we ultimately become more respectful of ourselves. And then we understand why the shofar blew loudly at Mount Sinai when we were receiving the 613 mitzvot, because it was enabling us to recognize our inner greatness and to understand that this is what freedom is all about. Freedom is the opportunity to become ever more reflective of our inner nature and our inner qualities, which is having been created in the image of God. That's what we're counting up toward. That's why Yovel happened the way it did, which we don't have anymore. That's why lands went back to original owners. Slaves were told, go out into the world, take responsibility for yourself. Don't rely on other people, and you'll learn to trust more in God. And that's why we count at this time of the year, day by day, to connect that freedom from artificial slavery, to put ourselves into a position to understand that we would rather be servants of God who are ultimately becoming more and more true to who we really are, and become more and more able to see ourselves for who we really are, which are great beings created in the image of God. Happy to answer any questions. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll meet again next week. And when we celebrate Lag BaOmer on Thursday, Wednesday night, Thursday, everyone should really enjoy. And it's a big celebration, and we'll talk more about that context next week. And have a good week. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Have a good night.